Sony has a very serious AAA problem. Let's talk about it. Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Botox Games, and today we're going to be covering the Insomniac leak that occurred last night, or at least one specific aspect of it. I do want to say this leak is very unfortunate. I feel for Insomniac. It must hurt to see your work leak like this, but also personal information was leaked. So if you don't know, about a week ago, a ransomware group had contacted Sony saying, hey, we hacked Insomniac. We got all this information. If you don't give us, I think it was like 20 Bitcoin or something, so $2 million, I think is what the conversion was, right? They were going to leak the information. Well, Sony didn't pay up, and all that information leaked last night. It was a crazy night going through all the leaks. So if you want to look them up, you can. I'm sure they're still up on Reddit and all that, but we won't be covering any of the new games releasing or any of that stuff right now. I want to talk about the numbers because I think there's some very interesting and potentially damning kind of information in this leak. So something that leaked throughout all of this was the lifetime sales and revenue and cost of development and all these different numbers for the games Insomniac releases. We actually also got a list of sales numbers for pretty much every Sony PS4 game as well just this morning, but I want to specifically focus on Insomniac in this video. So we have a list here of their recent games, right? So we're just going to read through these. Miles Morales sold lifetime 10.2 million copies. The total cost of development and potentially marketing could be bundled in with this. I'm not too sure, but just for the sake of argument, we'll include marketing, right? The total cost of everything was $156 million, and the game made them a total profit of $104 million with a 122% return on interest. That is technically Insomniac's most successful game, which is very interesting. But skipping over, this one's very sad. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart only sold 2.2 million copies, and it had a budget of $81 million. They actually lost $8 million on Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. That is so sad and unfortunate because that is, in my opinion, one of the PS5's best games. It's one of the PS5's only true exclusives that wasn't on PS4, I should say. And to see a game like that have a budget that big is surprising, but also lose so much money is also just very surprising. It's kind of unsustainable, so you might see where I'm going with this. And then the last game on this list that I'll talk about is Spider-Man 2, which just released. They're projecting 10.5 million sales with a budget of $315 million for that game, with an expected profit of $75 million. So a much lower return on investment than even Miles Morales, which was a smaller game. Now, a couple of factors for those three in particular. Miles Morales was on PS4 and PS5. Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart was a very early PS5 game. And Spider-Man 2, you could argue, was also relatively early in the PS5's lifecycle, whereas Spider-Man 2018 and Miles Morales, those came out much later in the PS4's lifecycle. So there was much more of an install base for them to sell that game to, whereas Rift Apart and Spider-Man 2 are kind of more limited with their current potential, I guess. But something very specific jumped out to me on this chart, and we didn't cover it, so if you're looking at the screen, you know what I'm talking about. Spider-Man 1 Remastered. If you remember, this game was bundled with Miles Morales in 2020 with the launch of the PS5. Miles Morales cost $49.99 in the US, but if you spent $69.99 in the US, you also got a copy of Spider-Man Remastered, essentially making that game at $20, and they never sold it standalone, I don't believe. At least not at retail. They may have eventually started selling it on PSN by itself, but the point is, it was a cheaper version of Spider-Man 1 bundled with Miles Morales, and it was a remastered version, right? They changed the face model for Peter. They redid lighting. The game is running at 60 FPS. The game looks beautiful. We found out through this leak that this game, this remastered version of Spider-Man 2018, and just keep in mind, this was only 2 years after that game released. This remaster cost $39 million for them to produce. They profited $11 million, so good on them for that, but $39 million for a remaster 2 years after the game came out is absurd. And frankly, that's just not sustainable. This is not a sustainable model anymore. I think Arlo actually just made a video talking about how AAA gaming is kind of having a bit of an issue right now. Well, this is the proof in the pudding. If a Ratchet & Clank game with a budget of $81 million is losing $8 million, there's a serious issue. If a remastered version of Spider-Man going straight from PS4 to PS5 costs $39 million, there's an issue. And frankly, even though Miles Morales made a lot of profit, even though Spider-Man 2 was projected to make a lot of profit, these games costing $300 million is absurd. Real quick, I want to direct us to a GameIndustry.biz article where they interviewed Shawn Layden, and this was a very famous interview a couple years back. If you don't know, Shawn Layden used to run PlayStation Worldwide Studios for pretty much the majority of the PS4 generation. This was a very interesting interview. He said, quote, "The problem with that model is it's just not sustainable," he said, explaining that the current generation has seen the cost of development reach between 80 million and 150 million for most AAA games, excluding marketing costs, which is fair, with production taking up to 5 years from start to finish. Quote, "I don't think that in the next generation you can take those numbers and multiply them by 2 and think that you can grow," he continued. "I think the industry as a whole needs to sit back and go, all right, what are we building? What's the audience expectation? What is the best way to get our story across and say what we need to say? It's hard for every adventure game to shoot for the 50 to 60 hour gameplay milestone because that's going to be so much more expensive to achieve. And in the end, you may close some interesting creators and their stories out of the market if that's the kind of threshold they have to meet. We have to reevaluate that." This was a great interview. I totally agree with him. Even back then, the writing was on the wall that the AAA development model is unsustainable. Budgets for video games should not cost this much, especially when you consider the fact that, I mean, yeah, Sony might have increased the price of their games to $70 in the US, but these games go on sale almost immediately. But let's talk about that Rift Apart number, right? So with Sony's other AAA M-rated mature games like The Last of Us, Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon, God of War, they have no issue turning a profit on those games because there's a fan expectation that this is what Sony's going to release. People like The Last of Us, people like God of War, and no matter how many of those games they make, they will sell, essentially, right? That's kind of what we've seen over the years. People love those franchises, they know what they're getting, and they are very comfortable spending the $60 or $70 on those new games when they release. God of War Ragnarok sold very well. Ghost of Tsushima as a new IP sold very well, which is very nice for Sucker Punch, but Rift Apart, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, something I think a lot of people would argue is one of the best PS5 games with a budget that is a fraction of Spider-Man 2, lost $8 million. This is what I mean when I say that Sony specifically has a AAA problem. This problem with budgets exploding, this goes for the entire industry, but I think it's a very specific thing for Sony here where they have almost trained their audience, I think, in a certain way to only buy the biggest budget game possible. They only buy the games that Sony puts 150 plus million into, and that just isn't sustainable if you want to have a healthy development environment. It just isn't, because when budgets are that high, the ability to create new stories and new IP in this medium is severely limited. Executives aren't going to be happy with, you know, greenlighting a game that's going to have a 200 million budget, but it's a new IP because it's unproven. That's why Sony's going for Marvel, because they see, okay, well, if we release a Marvel licensed game through Insomniac, it's going to do very well and we're going to guarantee ourselves a profit, but it stifles creativity and it stifles just the idea that they could even do something else. If Ratchet & Clank, a proven historic franchise, has a budget of $80 million and still loses money, you're kind of pigeonholed into only making one type of very AAA, very high budget exclusive game. And just to be clear, this isn't just an issue for Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. We did get some other sales numbers from Sony first-party games. Now, we don't know their budgets, or at least I haven't seen a document showing the budgets of these games, but a great example is Returnal, another fantastic PS5 exclusive. That game barely broke the million barrier. Like, just barely. It barely scratched that number. Demon's Souls sold 2 million. And once again, I see the argument, right? This was early in the PS5's life cycle, but you know, for Nintendo, this isn't an issue, right? They have those evergreen titles that continue to sell for years to come. But with Sony, it feels like that isn't necessarily happening. They just aren't having that evergreen, everlasting sales, with maybe the exception being Spider-Man, right? But on the same list, you see a game like Bloodborne, which was a total hit. We found out today sold 7.6 million copies. That is huge for a game like that, pre-Elden Ring, mind you. Of course, now From Software is a much bigger deal than they were even back in 2015. But Bloodborne selling 7.6 million copies is crazy. And the fact that they aren't even willing to do that again shows that Sony thinks they need to make one specific type of game. And this is something I've been feeling for a while. This is kind of an aside rant. I have been very fatigued by the style of game Sony creates. In the PS4 generation, it was very exciting to get this cutthroat kind of single-player narrative adventure games, right? That was very exciting. But now that we are going a whole nother generation getting the same types of games, it's undeniable that they're very great. I enjoyed my time with Spider-Man 2, for example, but to me, that experience was nowhere near as exciting as Spider-Man 1, considering it was just kind of more of the same style of game, which is what a sequel is. Let me be very clear. But you get what I'm saying, right? They're at a point now where they pretty much have to serve their core fan base. They know they can get 10 million copies of Last of Us, God of War Ragnarok, Horizon, and Spider-Man 2 out of you. They know they can sell those 10 million copies, and after that, that's kind of it. That's like the ceiling for Sony games, it feels like right now, which isn't healthy. When a game like Rift Apart has a budget of 81 million and loses 8 million, something is wrong. I really wish in this exact moment we knew budgets for Nintendo games, because Nintendo is very secretive about that. I mean, to be fair, Sony kind of is too. We shouldn't know this information. But I can't imagine any of Nintendo's comparable platforming games or 3D family games on the Switch cost anywhere near as much as Rift Apart. I think 81 million, and this is all pure speculation, we don't know. 81 million is probably like the ceiling for Nintendo development, right? Maybe Tears of the Kingdom was a little bit more than that. Maybe Metroid Prime's a little bit more than that because it's been going on for so long. But think about like Kirby and the Forgotten Land. We don't know how long that game was in development, but how much did that game cost to make? And look at how much it sold. It's the best-selling Kirby game. It sold like, I think, 6 million copies. And I'm sure they're very happy with how that game performed and how much they made off of it. But even something like, I mean, this is gonna sound stupid, but just for the sake of argument, something like Big Brain Academy on the Switch can sell over 1 million copies at $30. Surely that makes Big Brain Academy a more profitable game than almost anything Sony releases. And the point I'm making, right, isn't necessarily that Nintendo games are better. It's just that Nintendo has cultivated an audience and a fan base that is willing to buy and try different types of games. They aren't forced into making the same type of very AAA, very high production cost game to guarantee sales. They can experiment and release weird stuff, and the fan base still shows up to support it because they've been kind of, I don't want to sound like a freaking Nintendo puppy, but they've kind of been trained to try these new experiences. So that is going to do it for this video. I think this is a very serious issue that the industry needs to figure out. We didn't even talk about Xbox in this video, which is a whole nother can of worms with Xbox Game Pass. I mean, think about this, right? If a game like Spider-Man costs, you know, 300 million to make, Spider-Man 2 in this case, think about how much a game like Starfield costs to make. And then think about the fact that they gave that game away for free on Game Pass. Yes, I understand there's a monthly subscription, but think about that. There is clearly something going on here that is not sustainable, and I really hope the industry can figure it out, because right now it feels like Nintendo and other Japanese developers are really the only players in the game that know what they're doing. And even then, Square Enix has issues, Capcom has issues, but compared to Western development, it just feels like a mess. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. When I saw the number that Spider-Man Remastered cost to make of 39 million, a 39 million budget for a remastered PS4 game, I was shocked. I cannot believe that game cost so much to make. It makes you wonder how much The Last of Us Online cost Sony. It makes you wonder how much Naughty Dog put into The Last of Us Part 1 remake. How much did The Last of Us 2 Remastered cost? Did that cost 20 million, 40 million, 50 million? Who knows? I mean, they added a whole new mode to it, but these numbers are insane. And I wanted to talk about it because I can't believe some of these numbers. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Of course, subscribe here for more typically Nintendo content, but sometimes I'll branch out and cover PlayStation and Xbox as well. Of course, follow me on Twitter at BotoxGames. And until next time, folks, peace.